So I'm not sure if this has been done before, but I'm going to be assigning Star Wars characters personality types in this video. And I'm going to be focusing upon the episodes 4, 5, and 6, but I must disclaim before I do so that I will not be typing Obi-Wan or Anakin because you really need the context provided in the prequels in order to more thoroughly assess their cognition. If you enjoy the video and would like to see me do more like it, please let me know below because I do have a lot of fun with this stuff, and without further ado, let's jump into it, beginning with Luke Skywalker. When we first introduced to Luke, he has a kind of angsty teenager vibe, and for good reason. He is after all locked down on a remote desert planet with family obligations effectively preventing him from realizing his dreams. However, this very quickly introduces two key character traits. First of all, loyalty. Loyalty that is torn between his family on Tatooine and his friends in the rebellion. Secondly, we have idealism, and not in the classic sense because obviously everybody is somewhat idealistic, but more in the constancy of his fixation upon his dreams, and excitability in that regard as well. So as with many human beings, Luke is tuned into what is personally meaningful to him. But we also have a fluid oscillation between that which is meaningful to him and that which is meaningful to other people. There's a constant oscillation between introverted feeling, rumination, and extroverted feeling, harmonization. A kind of fluid oscillation that is usually only present in what I refer to as feeling compulsive types, for example, feeling in dominant or authority position. And in classic MBTI terms, this will just be a feeling type. Because it is relatively rarer for a feeling volitional type, for example, to so easily dip in and out of both external and internal emotional environments. And extroverted feeling certainly doesn't seem blind in any way, shape or form. We were immediately introduced to a solid engineering skill set, and later blown away by his piloting capabilities. However, this function is also far from chaotic within his character, and Luke does seem to possess a paranoia that other people may not be as clued in as he is. This alongside a generally aversive, this is what could go wrong mentality, does scream extroverted thinking, extroverted intuitive divergence. The emphasis is upon observation of extroverted thinking contingency, of a more aversive rather than incentive nature. While security and extroverted thinking does develop in this character significantly after the first film, he does start with the panicky hypervigilance typical of a less developed, divergent extroverted thinking. Introverted thinking, by contrast, is very seldom communicated to other people, with very little in the way of theoretical explanation or any kind of explanation altogether throughout his entire character arc. Most knowledge in this character's case has more to do with that which is extensive of external application or extensive of his own introverted feeling values. A TI-FE axis is even further unlikely when you consider his confrontation in the Mos Eisley Cantina. While Luke of course does have the polite respect typical of FI-FE fluidity, he was unable to mediate that particular conflict situation, rather just disengaging in a more FI-centric manner, and in doing so making the situation worse. Moving into the later films, we are introduced to another side of Luke. Both FE and TE convergence become a lot more activated, and especially in short, intense bursts, we are introduced to a leadership style typical of a much more fluid, dominant axis. It is important to bear in mind, however, that Luke does remain very much a solo player, but is happy and willing to enter via dip into extroverted feeling when the situation calls for it. We are also quickly introduced to an extraordinary battlefield adaptability, as demonstrated by his frankly genius technique for taking down the legs of the Empire AT-ATs, as well as his equally extraordinary ability to improvise in order to take down a second one after his ship crashes. This screams extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition, seamless integration of myriad different variables in real time, adapting to the emerging situation and improvising new and novel methods in order to overcome it. However, at the core of Luke Skywalker is an extremely convergent introverted feeling, introverted sensing pairing, with identity being incrementally adapted and transformed towards the person he wishes to become. While this is an incredible character all round, it is his introverted feeling, introverted sensing convergence that allows him to adapt and constantly learn in a mature way from new situations, in a way that other people may struggle to at that age. Other people at the age of Luke Skywalker, would not be able to become, for example, a Jedi Knight. But the usefulness of FI dominance here certainly plays in his favour. After all, introverted feeling dominance is often the epitome of eternal youth. This FI intensity, however, is not limited entirely to the self, as it might be in a case of, say, an introverted feeling convergent auxiliary, such as an INTJ or ISTJ, for example. Typical of FI dominance, the desire here for constant growth extends very much to others as well, shown initially in the potential he sees and then fosters in Han Solo, and later even Darth Vader himself. And finally, FI convergence is never complete without the axial relationship with extroverted thinking divergence. It is the balanced relationship Luke maintains between each of these functions that allows him to both acquire new skill sets and relate in an extremely introverted feeling manner upon new emerging potentials. And what better type for such an epic character arc than an introverted feeling dominant? So, with Luke Skywalker now typed as 9FP, it's time to tackle Han Solo. So with Han, we are immediately introduced to a fiercely independent character with a high level of opportunistic pragmatism. While this character does seem skilled enough at talking his way in and out of social situations in a playful manner, consistent with a more volitional, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, by contrast, seems a lot more private and closely guarded in his character, and in the later films, an area of relative confusion. When you are introduced to Han in The New Hope, he is already caught up in a tangled web, and one could argue he has already substituted a degree of introverted feeling consistency for material gain and perhaps survival. Whatever introverted feeling's position within this character's cognitive map, it is likely not a function the character considers particularly useful to engage. And those FI connections that do develop, besides of course his highly cemented existing ones, he quickly becomes insecure and uncertain about. It took time for him to form a connection to Luke and to realize he cared for the cause of the rebellion. And it took time for him to realize his affections for Leia were more than just a passing fancy. From the extroverted feeling, smooth talking and salesmanship we're introduced to at the start of the first film, it's more than reasonable to, from this information, consider Han an extroverted feeling convergent, like say, an ESTP. However, it is important to note these circumstances are well within his character's comfort zone. And once Han is placed outside of this modus vivendi, we are quickly introduced to a level of social awkwardness within his character. Firstly, he lacks pretty much any romantic game with Leia. Compare this to an actual ESTP like Lando Calrissian. Quickly becoming flustered and frustrated, oscillating between anger and passive aggressiveness, until once he realizes he has nothing really to lose, he just kind of goes for it. Secondly, there's very little maintenance of any kind of positive social affect, and again compare this to Lando. And we're introduced to another level of social awkwardness when he tries to improvise as a stormtrooper. He just seems a bit stiff. And finally, this character is independent to the extent of being completely and utterly averse to any kind of leadership position, becoming blunt and impatient in any situation requiring social management. In terms of thinking, both extroverted thinking and introverted thinking are highly developed within this character, but compared to, say, the tactical ability of Luke and Leia, Han relies far much more on rehearsed skill sets and internalized understandings of how things are. His skepticism about the Force absolutely screams TI-centric cognition, as everything must generally pass through a filter of objective understanding in order to be considered true. There are arguments to be made for both dominant and authority positions with regards to this function, but when one considers the extent to which introverted thinking is adapted throughout the movies, and also considers the more chaotic decision-making style of this character, TI convergence seems more the norm. And dominant introverted thinking is further supported here by the aforementioned hallmarks of oppositional FE. And this character's internal vision tends to be swept up in external inspiration in a manner more typical of the NI-SE auxiliary axis. While this character's improvisational adaptability may lead some credence to an extroverted intuition over extroverted sensing argument, generally this character tends to hone in on a single calculated risk, and there's very little indication of any kind of analysis paralysis. And typical of auxiliary, true auxiliary, introverted intuition. A desired contingency is set in motion from a TI-centric perspective. And of course this introverted intuition is more volitional by nature, because in terms of non-internalized courses of action, this character is far more reckless, demonstrated when he gets carried away in a moment and considers it a good idea to charge headlong into a squad of stormtroopers. While ESTP was certainly worth considering for this character, the convergent TI and the hyperdivergent extroverted feeling, considered alongside the whole lone wolf thing he has going on, makes ISTP the clear winner. And now let's tackle Han's friend, Chewie. So with Chewie, an introverted feeling filter is established right away. Those who pass through the filter are treated with love and affection, and those who do not are treated with either indifference or scorn. There is very little valuing of social harmony for its own sake within his character, and the contrast between the affection he gives to those he loves and those he does not speaks highly of an FI preference. Similarly with Chewbacca, what you see tends to be what you get. There are next to no facades or power plays within this character, and little in the way of social adaptability as well. So far we have two major character traits set up: loyalty to his friends and authenticity. Chewie can always be trusted to be very much himself. Indeed, neither side of the FETI axis tend to be demonstrated by this character. Like with many introverted feeling compulsive types, extroverted feeling is effective by way of expression through love and affection, for example, but is seldom used for its own sake. And in regards to introverted thinking, this individual is certainly not a talker. Chewie is much more a man of action than a man of words. This is not to say all TI users are chatterboxes, of course, with that just being one way of demonstrating internalized objective thought. But Chewie is certainly more oriented towards external manipulation, that is, the domain of extroverted thinking convergence over internal theorizing, for example. Furthermore, Chewie is not so much a passive observer either. As with many extroverted thinking convergent types, the emphasis is less upon patient observation and more upon action. The manner of this extroverted thinking employment, however, has more the spontaneous and improvisational aspects typical of the TEFI auxiliary axis. And in determining whether or not this character is an ESFP or ENFP, one should look to the focused nature with which Chewie engages external reality. Chewie is seldom doing 1,000 things at once, and is much more in his comfort zone when he has a single task or challenge to lock onto, in a manner typical of an extroverted sensing preference. Interestingly, just in the way that his best friend Han reconciles extroverted feeling with introverted feeling in a character arc depicting vulnerability and altruism, Chewbacca does a similar kind of thing, albeit from an FI into FE perspective. This character increasingly loosens up, becomes less aggressive, for example, throughout the 3 movies, until he can let so many people into his introverted feeling sphere as for FI and FE to become much more reconciled. So now it's time for Princess Leia. So Leia is an interesting case, and she was actually pretty hard to type because her cognition seems to change quite dramatically from the first film into the next 2. The first film introduces a high degree of independence, of course, but also a significant amount of altruistic attunement, and at one point we even hear her talk in an extremely ENFJ-like manner. Furthermore, within the same film, that is episode 4, her extroverted feeling employment seems extremely consistent and convergent, and comfortable, I might add. She consistently communicates her actions and intentions to her rescuers in a very FETI axis-like manner, and she's physically affectionate from the get-go. So far a TE developed ENFJ is certainly worth considering, but as the series progresses, the relationship between FE and TE seems to flip, with suddenly in The Empire Strikes Back the TE-NE pairing being accentuated over the socially effective FE-SE one. That being said, both TE-NE, holistic external management, and FE-SE, intense social affect, are consistently pronounced within this character, speaking of a high degree of individuation, because an ENFJ has a TE-NE dip and an ESTJ has a FE-SE dip. And possible character continuity errors aside, it is when we witness Leia's relationship with Han that feeling suddenly seems to be a little bit more secondary to thinking. Like the thinking dominant Han Solo himself, Leia here seems a little bit awkward and standoffish, and seems to be more interested in protecting her pride than fluidly navigating a complicated social situation. But ENFJ is still on the table here because the type can be a little bit awkward and standoffish when they feel vulnerable in this manner. While she does nonetheless remain a highly personable and charismatic individual throughout the series, if you were going to tally it up, extroverted feeling would be a little bit more insecure than extroverted thinking, which remains a highly adaptable and dynamic function throughout the entire series. Indeed, this constant rational emphasis makes extroverted codec dominance all but certain at this point. And while both TE and FE are certainly strong within this character, the tactical ingenuity, strategic mindset, and comfort happily just jumping into action in any given situation makes extroverted thinking the more likely gateway function. Furthermore, while there does seem to be some individuation within the perceptual continuum as well, overall it is NE and SI that are accentuated over SE and NI. While the first film did indicate a high level of internalized vision and wisdom, NI thereafter seemed more secondary to extroverted intuitive improvisation and macro management, as well as introverted sensing-based resource preservation and absoluteness of value. So far then we have an FE-SE pairing, a TE-NE pairing, a TI-NI pairing, and an FI-SI pairing. But we've yet to determine what the primary gateways are. The collectivistic altruism and FE communication and social affect, alongside the natural internalized wisdom and envisioning, makes ENFJ a worthy secondary consideration. But the constant emphasis upon TE, NE direction, as well as the sheer dimensionality of this dominant function, makes ESTJ the likely candidate, with ENFJ more of a dip type within Leia. Intuitive thought, that is, holistic logic and management, alongside sensing feeling, the concretization of self and values, are certainly the consistent pairings of this character. Having already been seemingly individuated from the get-go, Leia's character arc is less intense than that of the other characters I've mentioned so far. In terms of cognitive functions, I do believe this character already started with a high degree of development, with much of the cognitive development that she does make on top of her already highly individuated state being more along the lines of transitioning from a codec-dominant rational emphasis into a more lens-dominant experiential one. She does yet remain a highly serious character. Now let's get on to the droids. So if there's one function that defines C-3PO, it's extroverted feeling. FE in this character is very much constant and unabating, but in contrast to the more convergent FE often displayed by Princess Leia, the extroverted feeling in this character is much more cautious and divergent. I mean, protocol droid generally screams divergent FE. C-3PO is consistently seen to be abiding by social protocol, placing special emphasis upon the exchange of social pleasantries, for example. And as with many extroverted feeling authority types, the breach of such decorum tends to be met with grumbling and other passive-aggressive behaviours. And this very passive-aggressiveness comes out most obviously in his dynamic with his old friend R2-D2. As with many divergent FE users, once the parameters of a relationship have been established, that's when TI really tends to take the brunt of the TI-FE axis. But another, arguably even stronger pressure point of this character lies in his hyperdivergent extroverted intuition. An NE oppositional is the ultimate what can go wrong function, as demonstrated multiple times in his absolute aversion to taking any kind of risk. And this divergent extroverted intuition is certainly being related upon by a dominant introverted sensing. As with many lens-dominant types, the emphasis is not upon introverted sensing entertainment of multiple possibilities for their own sake, but more for the sake of continued internal harmony. As with many IXFJs, the introverted thinking auxiliary is used kind of sparingly, primarily in an intensive way as concerns the user's primary areas of interest, in this case languages and the art of social exchange. This specialism, however, does not mean C-3PO holds back with scathing criticism upon any given plan, particularly when that plan carries risks. And R2-D2 is in many ways the polar opposite of C-3PO, where one is highly risk-averse and cautious, the other one freely embraces the moment in an improvisational manner. Where one operates according to practicality, the other one acts according to their own innate sense of values and a sense of loyalty. The sheer versatility of this droid unit, considered alongside its tendency to take everything in its stride, points very strongly to an extroverted intuitive preference. As opposed to the more divergent and aversive extroverted intuition of its counterpart, however, the NE of R2-D2 is much more optimistic and, frankly, chaotic. High use of this convergent NE considered alongside a generally outgoing and externally forward-moving attitude points to cognitive extroversion. There was also in this character a general action orientation and lack of internally analytical disposition. Not only does the contrast between these two droids exemplify the difference between convergent and divergent extroverted intuition, but it also demonstrates the difference between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking. The playful and improvisational attitude this character takes to new situations, as well as the general stubbornness and tendency to act more in accordance to its own values, points to extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking convergence at the behest of an FI authority. Hence, we are left with an ENFP. And while I'm saving Anakin and Palpatine for a later date, I didn't want to leave this episode without some kind of villain. So I'm going to analyse Moff Tarkin, one of the more ruthless characters within the series. Tarkin is very much the embodiment of TE efficiency. However, just because this function is strong within this character, it does not mean it's its dominant function. One should consider the attitude first. First and foremost, Tarkin is consistently loyal and reliable to the furthest possible extreme. His devotion to the Empire is unwavering, as is his attention to detail and general work ethic. It's fair to say this character is on the ball. And there was very little display of the hyper-individuality and autonomy typical of TE dominance, with extroverted thinking here being much more consistent and reliable in a manner of authority position. The strength of his conviction alone points to dominant SIFI, that is, concrete and absolute identity, and his ability to juggle multiple responsibilities alongside each other whilst seamlessly overseeing a huge operation is also very indicative of divergent NETE. While certainly not the most moral manifestation, I don't even think the Emperor himself would resort to blowing up an entire planet for the sake of proving a point. Moff Tarkin is yet a good example of a divergent ISTJ, really maximizing their TE potential. And now let's dive into Yoda. So when people see Yoda, they of course see the wise sage archetype, oftentimes attributed more to INFJs. And this is not entirely unfair. There's plenty of NI insight, and the altruism that tends to coincide with an FE authority. However, with this character, especially in these three films, I see little indication of NITI. There is a lack of holistic internal analysis, and reasoning is typically not thoroughly explained. And I wouldn't say there's a huge amount of FE tact and diplomacy either. Rather, this character is more of a just-do-it attitude, more typical of a TE-SE pairing. I do think Yoda is introverted, but while NI is certainly employed in a convergent, independent manner, I don't see much of the inner experiential emphasis more typical of NI dominance. Generally, Yoda is a character who speaks absolute, although in this case sometimes reductionistic, truths in aid of radical inner transformation. This is FI-NI. The emphasis of Yoda's internal world is rather to aspire towards and embody a kind of ideal, and shape other people through the same process. There are no shades of grey with this character, more typical of the FITE axis, although of course this is a oversimplification. The emphasis is more upon willpower and conviction over subtle internal analysis. Highly developed, or just intellectually inclined variants of this type can often be misidentified as INFJs, often owing to the near-identical archetype they tend to embody. And as I said in my ISFP, ISTP, INFJ, INTJ comparison, You can make a case for ISFPs being the true INFJs anyway. They are an introverted feeling dominant, so an IJ, because the judging function is in dominant position, with an intuitive assignment to feeling, rendering it an INFJ. So yeah, you can say according to Yoda's cognitive functions, he is an INFJ. He just happens to be an introverted feeling dominant. So that concludes the video. I really hope people have enjoyed it, and if you'd like to see the next episode in this series, let me know down below. Well, that being said, I probably will be making the next episode in this series anyway for my own personal enjoyment, but I hope you all get a kick out of this as well. If you are interested in what type you might be, I recommend checking out the CPT type service, and you can be typed by either me or my typing associate, Rob. CPT is also on Patreon, so if you are interested in supporting the channel and the theory on an additional level, it would be absolutely amazing to see you there. But of course, I would appreciate your support over here as well. And finally, just a reminder that the second edition of the ebook is now released. If you already own a copy, I highly recommend going and downloading the new one for free. And if you've been holding back and purchasing the first edition in anticipation of the new one, now's the time to grab it. And for those of you interested in acquiring a physical copy of the book, thanks to some extensive reformatting I've done, that is now possible. So that's it for me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.